An herb supplier pays $40 a pound for this plant. Britain, Canada, Germany, and Australia banned it outright. And yet, in Amish farm country, families have grown it in the same garden corner for generations on purpose. In the 1870s, a Quaker horticulturist named Henry Doubleday was working the fields of Essex with a practical problem in mind. At the time, Britain's postal system was growing fast, and the cost of imported gum for postage stamps was a constant irritation for anyone who handled letters and ledgers. Doubleday, known for his experiments with potatoes and adhesives, set his sights on a new solution. He went searching for a plant that could yield a homegrown glue. His attention landed on Russian comfrey, a leafy perennial with a reputation for sticky sap. He arranged for seedlings to be shipped from St. Petersburg, not as a miracle cure, but as a possible answer to a mundane industrial question. The comfrey that arrived in Essex was no exotic secret, no whispered folk remedy. It was a plant chosen for its potential to solve a specific material challenge. Doubleday's experiments with extracting gum from comfrey root didn't pan out. The sap lacked the right viscosity, and the dream of a British-grown stamp adhesive faded. But the story didn't end there. The plant, now rooted in English soil, caught the attention of local gardeners and smallholders. Its deep green leaves and vigorous growth hinted at other uses, and its journey from Russian seedbeds to English garden rows was just beginning. What started as one man's failed adhesive experiment quietly redirected the course of comfrey's history. Instead of vanishing from the record, the plant slipped into the hands of practical growers, setting up a new chapter, one that would eventually reach far beyond Essex and far beyond the world of postage stamps. A single letter addressed to the head gardener at the Russian Imperial Palace in St. Petersburg set in motion a chain of events that would quietly reshape English horticulture. In the late 18th century, Empress Catherine the Great issued a standing order. The keepers of her palace gardens must be English or Scottish. This was no mere preference for foreign talent. It was a deliberate strategy to import the latest horticultural skills and plant breeding techniques from Britain. Among those chosen was John Bush, a Hackney nurseryman with a reputation for practical innovation. Bush accepted the post in 1771 and spent the next 18 years cultivating the palace grounds, introducing new species, and experimenting with border plantings that included both native comfrey and imported Russian hybrids. Bush's tenure connected two worlds, the imperial confidence of St. Petersburg and the restless curiosity of English nurseries. The palace gardens became a living laboratory where accidental hybridization was not just possible, but likely. Seedlings with unusual vigor or leaf structure, traits now associated with Russian comfrey, were gathered, studied, and on occasion sent back across the continent. In the 1790s, packets of these hybrid symphytum seedlings made their way to Loddiges, the famed London plant dealer, and from there into the wider English gardening trade. These were not wild seeds plucked from a roadside, but carefully managed stock, selected and shipped by a head gardener who understood their potential. The significance of this exchange lies in its traceability. Unlike many plants whose origins are lost to time, comfrey's journey from the Russian imperial beds to English soil passed through official channels and left a paper trail, however incomplete. The plant arrived not as a curiosity, but as a managed crop, its value recognized by those who handled it. This formal root set comfrey apart, giving it a provenance that would later matter to both scientists and skeptics. The roots of the comfrey story, quite literally, run deep, from the ornamental borders of St. Petersburg to the productive rows of English gardens. Comfrey's reputation among gardeners and small farmers comes down to what happens below the surface. The roots of a mature comfrey plant can push past 6 feet into the soil, far deeper than the roots of lettuce, beans, or even most fruit trees. While ordinary vegetables skim the upper layers for nutrients, comfrey mines the subsoil, reaching minerals that would otherwise remain locked away. The leaves, broad and fast-growing, act as a kind of conveyor belt, pulling these buried reserves upward. Laboratory tests have measured potassium levels in dried comfrey leaves at nearly 7% by weight, several times higher than what is found in farmyard manure or standard compost. Calcium and magnesium ride along too, concentrated in the leaf mass each time it is cut. For gardeners, the real payoff comes when these mineral-rich leaves are chopped and dropped onto the soil, used as mulch, or brewed into a liquid feed. Potassium, in particular, is the nutrient that tells tomatoes and peppers to stop making leaves and start setting fruit. Without enough potassium, plants stay leafy and green, but fail to deliver a harvest. Comfrey's deep-rooted habit makes it a classic example of what some call a dynamic accumulator, a plant that draws nutrients from deep in the ground and stores them where other crops can use them. In plain terms, comfrey is nature's way of moving minerals from where roots cannot reach to where they matter most, right at the surface, ready for the next crop. Lawrence D. Hills did not accept comfrey's reputation at face value. In the 1950s, he set out to test the plant's agricultural worth with the kind of rigor more often reserved for cash crops. At the Henry Doubleday Research Association trial grounds in Barking, Essex, Hills organized a 5-year experiment comparing 30 different comfrey varieties. Each cultivar was planted, observed, and measured for leaf yield, nutrient content, and ease of management. The standout was labeled Barking 14, a sterile hybrid that could only be propagated by root division. Unlike wild comfrey, which scatters seed freely and can overrun a garden, Barking 14 produces no viable seed at all. This single trait changed comfrey from a potential weed into a controllable asset for small farms and gardens. Hills published his findings and recommended Barking 14 as the variety of choice for anyone wanting the benefits of comfrey without the risk of it spreading out of control. Today, those who know the difference insist on Barking 14, not the seeding kind, precisely because of its sterility and reliability. In July 2001, the FDA ordered all comfrey dietary supplements off the U.S. market. The agency's concern was clear. Comfrey contains pyrrolizidine alkaloids, compounds that can cause serious liver damage if eaten or drunk. The ban targeted capsules, teas, tinctures, and any product meant for internal use. At the same time, the FDA made a point of not extending this restriction to external or garden uses. Comfrey creams, ointments, and most relevant to gardeners, its use as a soil amendment or fertilizer remained legal. This is not a blanket ban on the plant itself, but a specific action based on the risk of internal consumption. While comfrey's old reputation as a healing herb fueled its popularity in supplement culture, current law draws a sharp line. It may not be sold for ingestion, but its value in the garden is untouched by federal regulation. On Amish farms in Lancaster County, comfrey is handled with a kind of quiet precision. When the leaves reach their peak, growers cut them down and scatter them right where they fall. This is the chop and drop method. The fresh cuttings form a thick green mulch that breaks down fast, returning nutrients to the topsoil and suppressing weeds in the process. No hauling, no spreading of synthetic blends, just a living conveyor belt from deep soil to surface. For crops that need a quick boost, the same leaves are soaked in barrels of rainwater until they break down into a dark, potent liquid. This is comfrey tea, a home-brewed fertilizer poured around tomatoes, peppers, or potatoes. Both methods rely on the plant's natural mineral haul, letting each patch of comfrey feed the next round of crops, season after season, without a trip to the store. Fresh comfrey leaves serve another role when tossed into the compost heap. Their high nitrogen content and rapid decay act as a natural accelerator, heating up the pile and breaking down woody material faster than grass clippings or kitchen scraps alone. Amish farmers often layer 2 or 3 inches of just-cut comfrey into their compost, knowing that this green boost can turn a sluggish heap into rich, dark humus in a matter of weeks. The same leaves, gathered by the armful, find their way into potato trenches each spring. Wilted comfrey is laid at the base of the furrow, directly beneath the seed potatoes. As the plants grow, the comfrey decomposes, releasing potassium, calcium, and magnesium right where the tubers need it most. This method supports healthy, vigorous crops without a single bag of store-bought fertilizer. Together, these practices reveal a working system built around a single plant, a system that quietly sidesteps the costs and limitations of commercial inputs season after season. Today, fertilizer giants profit selling what a comfrey patch does for free, drawing nutrients 6 feet down, packing up to 7% potassium in its leaves, and thriving as a sterile balking 14 hybrid. The real question is, why trust the sales pitch over a tradition that Amish farmers never abandoned? Share your perspective below.